All right, so this is going to be round 2 of me attempting to record these lectures. I apologize that Zoom deleted out all of the old ones. I don't know what happened. It seems like everything I recorded last week just disappeared. So we're going to try this again. So today's module, we're talking about ancient Egypt. And so we're going to talk about the formation of ancient Egypt and how it kind of coalesced into this really interesting and fascinating civilization that we've all probably been fascinated with since we were kids in some sense, even if it's just from things like the mummy movies. So in this first lecture, we're going to be talking about pre-dynastic period of Egypt, which lasts from about 4000 to 3000 BC. And this is, like we did in Southwest Asia, like a transitional period. Pre-dynastic period is not civilization yet, but it's starting to lay the foundations for civilization. So last time we talked about Northern Africa and the Nile Valley way back very quickly in the Neolithic section of this course. We talked about how the Nile Valley and the Nile River Delta are probably among the, if not the richest agricultural niche in the world. There's a reason that a lot of people coalesced into this region of the world in prehistory. There's a reason that a lot of people live there today. And it's because the land is really, really good for farming. You can produce a lot of food. It's really great. Despite this, we also talked about how that even though it's really great for its agricultural potential, agriculture is actually going to come very, very late in the region because the region is going to be chock full of wild resources. So even though it's really good for farming, what that also means is that it's really good for wild plants, wild animals, and things like that. And so people aren't going to necessarily become agriculturalists very early or become Neolithic very early in Egypt because they have plenty of resources. And we've talked a lot about how hunting and gathering in general is just an easier lifestyle. It's an easier economy. And so you just work with what you've got. And so here, agriculture and animal domestication really doesn't appear in the Nile River Valley or Delta, or what we now know of today as Egypt, until about 8,000 to 7,000 years ago, with full-time farming, where people are actually doing this full-time and having very little reliance on wild resources, appearing about 7,500 BC. And what's really interesting about this very early agriculture is that these very early Egyptians are going to be focused mainly on foods that are going to be the staples of what we know of as like classically ancient Egypt. Things like emmer wheat, barley, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. All of these things are going to start here in these earliest forms of domesticated agriculture in Egypt, in Neolithic Egypt, and then they're going to continue to be important in ancient Egypt as well. And farming is going to spread to all parts of what we now know of today as Egypt by 4000 BC. So by 4000 BC, these Egyptian villages all have a full-time agricultural economy. Now, in these very early days, in these kind of like pre-dynastic periods, in this very, very early part of the pre-dynastic period, people are in civilization. They're not state-level societies. They're not complex. But instead, by about 6000 BC, what we're seeing is people are just what we consider to be Neolithic. They're living in small villages, these villages that tend to be permanent and long-term, or at least recurrent. So that's kind of like when people would move between different villages, like that slash and burn agriculture in China. And these things aren't super large. They're not super small. We're seeing about 14 family units in each one, but they're very classically Neolithic. So at about 6000 BC, Egypt has become the classic Neolithic. What's going to start changing though about 4000 BC is that we're going to have all of these very unconnected villages doing their own thing, living their own lives, just kind of doing that Neolithic vibe. And all of a sudden, they're going to quickly start transmutating into these organized social, economic, and political, units very quickly, right? So all of a sudden, we've got these very detached Neolithic villages that just quickly now start becoming these larger like polities that are all interconnected. So they all start having very similar cultures, similar economies, maybe similar leaderships and centralized politics. And it's impressive. It's puzzling to us because if you remember back in Southwest Asia, that process was very long. So it's impressive to us, but it's puzzling. We don't know why it's happening. But we start to see this happening very, very quickly around 4000 BC in southern Egypt, and then it's going to cover all of Egypt by 3000 BC. And archaeologically, how we know this is happening is we have 3 lines of evidence that show us that all of these interconnected villages are all quickly becoming a single social unit. The first is what we saw back in Southwest Asia with like the Samarran pottery and the Halafian pottery, which is that the pottery is just, we see a spread of pottery styles and architectural styles. And now all of a sudden, everybody in Egypt is making the same kinds of pottery with the same kinds of decorations, and all of their houses start to resemble one another. This is different than what we were seeing in the earlier Neolithic period of Egypt, where every village seemed to have its own style of pottery and architecture. When everybody starts doing things the same way, this suggests to us as archaeologists that they probably had contact amongst people over large areas of the country. So very interesting there. The other thing too is that what we're starting to see in a lot of these villages is that people are starting to invest a lot of labor and resources into building certain things, building certain monuments, building certain buildings, which does suggest to us this unique distribution of wealth, power, and prestige. We talked in the past about how when all of a sudden people start building these large monuments, somebody had to be organizing those and somebody had to be coercing and controlling the labor. So all of a sudden we're starting to see the very early elements of social inequalities. And then finally, we have some just like indisputable evidence, like what you see on the screen right now, which is called the Narmer palette. And the Narmer palette is an illustration to us that we've interpreted as archaeologists that this dude who's standing up here has kingly power and authority. So we start to see these artistic representations of true social inequalities. So suddenly, around 4000 BC, all of these things start popping up. The spread of similar pottery styles, the spread of similar architectural styles, massive amounts of labor and resources being put into certain elements of the society, and also things like the Narmer palette starting to pop up. And so this shows us that Egypt is very quickly becoming, going from Neolithic unconnected villages to very much a single socio-political unit. In Southwest Asia, this took a really long time, but in Egypt, it seems to be happening relatively overnight in this way of that in prehistory, we've already covered millions of years of prehistory. So a few hundred to maybe 1,000 years does appear to us that it's overnight. And what we see popping up then are 2 major kind of early urban centers for Egyptian life. And the first is, and I'm going to butcher this because I'm not an Egyptian scholar and I've read about a lot of these things, but I haven't heard a lot of these things. So if you're somebody who's really into Egypt, you probably know how to pronounce these better than I do. But the first of these is Hierakonpolis. And this is the largest and most complex cluster of settlements in Egypt. And you can see Hierakonpolis here, and this is where it's located on the map. And in many ways, this still represents what we would think of as like a Neolithic village, in that people lived in these rectangular semi-subterranean houses that are made of mud, brick, and thatch. We've been seeing that in the Neolithic, earlier in the course, that they're worshiping at these small wooden shrines, that they are farming, but also hunting and collecting wild resources. And so in a lot of ways, this isn't necessarily like ancient Egypt yet. I want to keep emphasizing that. This is still very much pre-dynastic. It still has a lot of elements of the Neolithic because it's still transitional. But what we are going to start seeing is that we're starting to see this society start to quickly stratify into a social hierarchy in which we have somebody at the top, as illustrated by the Narmer palette, and then people that are ranked below them. And what we're also seeing is that while a lot of these things tend to be small wooden shrines, we don't have large temples or things yet. There is a semblance of religious unity that is starting to form across large swaths of what we now know today as Egypt. So again, this is a transitional period because we're starting to find some of those elements of social complexity that we want to find, things like religious unity, a social hierarchy with social inequalities that seem to be led by ideological coercion and not just pure violence and control. But still relatively small villages. You know, this is an example of villages kind of coalescing together into an urban center, but haven't quite reached that yet. Hyrcanopolis is also where we found the Narmer palette, and so a lot of Egyptians have started to inquire whether, because this that looks like an Egyptian king is there, that it might have indicated that Hyrcanopolis was the earliest of the Egyptian capitals, that Hyrcanopolis in this transitional pre-dynastic period represents something different, and that it represents that this may have been the center of like kingly authority and government authority, at least in the south of Egypt. Because what I want to emphasize and what I'm going to keep re-emphasizing even in the next couple of lectures, is that Egyptian civilization started in the south and then spread northward. And you can see that Hyrcanopolis here is pretty far south. It's at least in the southern half of Egypt. And so it may represent this early coalescing of Egyptian civilization in the south here that's going to then later spread north. The other major kind of center of Egyptian life here in the transitional pre-dynastic period is Naqada, and you can see that Naqada is slightly north of Hyrcanopolis, but still relatively south when we're thinking about Egyptian civilization. And by the middle of the 4th millennium BC, Naqada was already a large town and had a lot of similarities with Hyrcanopolis. They're probably the largest communities in southern Egypt. It's a village that's fully dependent on agriculture, but also seems to be the second major urban center that's forming. And Hyrcanopolis and Naqada are going to be two of the places where we're going to see ancient Egyptian civilization really forming. Right. Now, this isn't that to suggest that the only place where Egypt is. This doesn't suggest that the only place or time that Egyptian civilization is forming or complexity in Egypt is forming is in the south. The south is going to be the major center for the development of complex societies in Egypt. But there's also going to be a lot going on in northern Egypt in the pre-dynastic period as well. Large and wealthy communities are going to start appearing in the north slightly later than Naqada and Hyrcanopolis, around 3650 BC. Mahdi and El Omari are two of the most common of these. I don't think either of them are on this map, but they are in the northern section here. And the reason that the north is going to be very important for the development of Egyptian civilization is because these northern communities are in contact with and have trade networks with places like Palestine, the Levant, and even the very northern sections of the Nile Valley. And we've already talked about how civilization and complexity is developing earlier in the Southwest Asian, localities than we're seeing here in ancient Egypt. So it's going to be very important because Southwest Asia is going to have a lot of trade goods. It's going to have a very well-organized economy, as we've already talked about, and they're going to trade a lot of these goods with them. And then slowly what we're going to see over time is that by like 3000 BC, more communities are going to start popping up. Places like Abu Omar and Buto. And a lot of these places are going to have evidence of complexity, mostly through the burial evidence. we're going to see that burials are displaying that there were a lot of wealthy and very powerful people who are buried with very expensive and luxurious items, distinctive pottery, alabaster jars, slate palettes, and other things like that. At Buto, which is on the map here, it's very far north in Egypt. At Buto, we're going to see that people are being buried with clay clones that are similar to the ones at the Uruk period of Southwest Asia, right? And Buto is also going to be an important port for trade across the Mediterranean. So what we're going to see through all of these different things is that the north is also going to be very important for the development of Egyptian civilization. Egyptian civilization is going to appear first in the south and move up, but it's not like the north is just like a bunch of people running around living in these like really deeply prehistoric villages. A lot of development is happening here that's going to make it very easy for Egyptian civilization to spread. And we're going to cover that in the next lecture. But here, the pre-dynastic period, again, it's transitional. We're starting to see the origins of larger villages and social inequalities and long-distance trade and a powerful socio-political elite and things like that. And we're going to keep seeing more and more development of civilization in the next lecture.